Well, let's turn to 1 Timothy chapter 3. I want to say thank you to Bailey for teaching last Wednesday night. He did a great job. Continuing with that thought out of John 21 about following Christ, what that looks like. Thankful for Jake, too, to be able to open the Word of God. The Lord has truly blessed our church over the years to give us men who can handle the Word and not just teach it, but able to preach it as well in a way that honors and glorifies Christ. So one of the marks that from my vantage point, that the church is growing and the church is healthy is that God gives it preachers, right? Not just teachers. I mean, we need teachers. Teachers can be different stripes and shades within the church, but the Lord giving the church preachers, I believe, is a special gift for sure. And I think the Lord has given us that easily by looking at what God has done. All right, so tonight we are picking up, I think last time we were in 1 Timothy, we started looking at chapter 3. We only made it barely through verse 1, right? I plan to get a little further than just that. My intent in taking us through 1 Timothy is not, and I do this, if you've been here any length of time, you know my proclivity is to not rush through any book that I'm teaching you, right? I could do that. A lot of guys take that approach. They take they don't look at the text from a 30,000-foot view. They kind of get about 13,000 feet, 15,000 feet, and kind of go through a book and scan its themes and sort of deep dive here and then back out and kind of keep moving. And there's benefit in that at times, but the way I'm wired, for some reason, this is just how I study. This is how I need to understand the text. So especially on a night like tonight, what I'm going to share with you really is just a fruit of me, because this isn't a sermon, right? We know that. There might be elements of preaching that might naturally sort of come out as we study this text. But what I'm going to do, hopefully, is just walk through the text with us, and it's just sort of a fruitfulness of what I've already looked at this week, sort of giving you the gist of what each word means when we start looking at the character qualities that we are to look for in elders, giving you a little insight into what does it mean for a man to aspire to the office of overseer. I just want you to be able to grab those things and understand them a little bit better. With that being said, let's look at verses 1 through 7. I'm going to read it for us, and then we're going to just jump into this text together. Paul says, "It is a trustworthy saying, if any man aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a good work. An overseer then must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, temperate, sensible, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not addicted to wine, or pugnacious, but considerate, peaceable, free from the love of money, leading his own household well, having his children in submission with all dignity. But if a man does not know how to lead his own household, how will he take care of the church of God? And not a new convert, so that he will not become conceited and fall into the condemnation of the devil. And he must have a good reputation, that with those outside the church, so that he will not fall into reproach and the snare of the devil." We'll stop there. The local church, if you think about it as an entity, is the focal point of God's mission in the world. If you wanted to know what is God doing in the world redemptively, you must look at it from the lens that the church is the spearhead of God's plan. God uses Christians, God uses the church, which you are a part of, to reach the lost world. If the church then is the spearhead of His purposes in the world, then the local church needs to be very aware and keen to understanding that leadership within the church is important, right? It's very important. And when a church does not take the leadership of itself as important, when it doesn't look at what the New Testament prescribes as what church government ought to look like, it will never rise to the level of effectiveness that God had intended for the church. Listen, bad leadership can have serious consequences, right? Poor leadership can even have worse ramifications. Now let's think about world history just for a moment. And I'm going to give you just a little snapshot of world history. Neville Chamberlain, anybody know who that is? He was the Prime Minister of Great Britain from 1937 to 1940. And he was largely associated with the policy of appeasement toward Adolf Hitler in Nazi Germany. Many historians, if you read, claim that it was Chamberlain's lack of action and astonishing naivety and cowardice toward Hitler that gave Hitler the boldness to pursue conquest of Europe and to further deepen Europe in Nazis' reign. And it wasn't until Winston Churchill became the Prime Minister of Great Britain that England took its stand against the Nazi regime. So just from that snippet of not church history, but world history, you see that leadership really matters. Chamberlain, get this, he was negotiating with Hitler to the degree to give the British Army, the British Navy, over to Germany. This is what weak leadership does. So the example from world history makes the point that leadership matters, especially within the church. The Church of Jesus Christ, I would say, rises or falls based upon the leadership of the local assembly. Listen, we already have learned, you know this, I could quiz you guys and ask you, why did Paul leave Timothy at Ephesus? And one of the main reasons he left Paul at Ephesus was because there was a lack of godly leadership. There was a lack of biblical leadership. Paul left Titus at Crete to establish in every church elders, because Paul understood without biblical leadership, churches will flounder. But you may be sitting here tonight and asking the question, well, Jason, why should we study this text? This is about elders, right? This is about, you sit there and say, I'm not going to be an elder. Why do I need to study this, right? Why do we need to learn these kinds of things? Well, listen, we need to, as the body, study these kinds of texts, especially these objective standards that we're going to see in a minute, for elders, because it is important for the church to know so that they know what to look for in future elders, right? Where are elders going to come from? Hopefully from our own body. Jake is an exception. We hired him because we needed another full-time pastor, but hopefully other lay elders are going to come from our own body. So we need to know the resume, the CV that they need to have, right? If we're going to place the right men in those right positions. Another reason that we need to understand these objective requirements is so that it can empower the congregation to pray for their elders, to help their elders, and also to hold accountable future elders and current elders to the biblical standard. This is why it's important for us to study these passages. This is why it's important for you to understand why Paul gave this list of character qualities and abilities and leadership abilities in this particular text. So with that being said, Paul here, starting in chapter 3, has given us 3 blocks of instruction. The first block of instruction is the calling of the church elder. We saw that in the subjective desire of someone who says, I desire the office of overseer. And he says, this is a trustworthy statement. This is something you need to pay attention to. This is something that needs to be highlighted. If someone says, hey, sign me up for that office, I want to be in that club. And he says, if that's true, it's something to celebrate. But then Paul says, if that aspiration is there, if that subjective desire is there needs to be a way to measure whether or not that subjective desire matches the objective requirements that God gives. And then thirdly, which we won't get to tonight, there is a list of abilities in these qualities that every aspiring church leader needs to have. And we see this in the list itself. That third category, if you will, it is the ability to teach. I want you to notice that with me just as a means of just sort of getting you used to seeing this. He tells us that the potential leader, the aspiring leader, needs to have the ability to teach. And that's found in verse 2. And that's not a character trait. That is an ability, something he needs to be able to do. And then in verse 4, there's another ability. And you read that, it says this, leading his own household well. Some have said, well, this is just to see if he's a good father and husband. No, that's not the point. The point is he a leader? That's the point. One of the jobs of the shepherd, pastor, is to lead. 1 Timothy 5:17 says, the elders who rule well. Ruling is part of our job. And when you are a leader of a family, what do you have to do? I mean, just think of the dads in here today. You have to lead your family spiritually. You lead them financially. You make sure your kids are getting education. You make sure they're provided for. Just think of the list of leadership qualities that are built within just leading a man's own home. And if he can't lead his own family, provisions, care, protection, we could spend a whole night just talking about that ability. If you look across the church and you see that man is struggling to lead his family, spouse is running things, he's kind of following, the kids are a mess, whatever the case might be, that guy's not going to fit the bill for an elder. Paul makes it very clear when he says, leading his household well, having his children in submission with all dignity, and then verse 5, look at it. Don't look at me. Look at the text. But if a man does not know how to lead his own household, what does it say? So there is ability there. He has to be a leader at home. He has to know. So there's abilities here in this text that are baked into these qualities. So we'll get to that. And I don't want to steal my own thunder by preaching that tonight or teaching that tonight. But here's what I want you to see. There are ultimately 15 character qualities mentioned here. And this is the objective requirements for the man who aspires to the office of overseer. There are 15 of them. And if we wanted to divide these, and this is what I've done, and this is how we're going to study them tonight, there's two groups there's two sets of character qualities. The first group of character qualities would fall under a category which I would call Christian morality. Excellent Christian morality. Those are going to be the first 7 qualities that we're going to see. And then there is an internal look at the man. And that's the next 7 sets of character qualities, which start after able to teach. Because in verse 3 and following, you have the man's daily life, if you want to think of it like that. He doesn't drink wine. He's not addicted to wine. He's not a fighter. He's not pugnacious. He's considerate. He's peaceable, free from the love of money. And then it gets to him leading his home. These are like daily living. You could even say this is like how he responds to the world almost, right? So we're only going to look at that first set, the Christian morality aspect of Christian character. And the first one you see there is found in verse 2. And Paul says, an overseer then, if he desires this work, if he aspires to this office, here's the test, the objective test. Is this man above reproach? So this is the first list of Christian morality. And really, we think about above reproach. Just think about those words together. He's above. He's on the hill, right? And all the muck is below him. That's basically what is being conveyed here. There's nothing that he has gotten himself into that would tarnish his character. So the man who aspires to the work of overseer must be above reproach. This is a general statement, listen, about the man's overall character. It's really just a general statement. The Bible Knowledge Commentary outlines this particular trait this way. He must be, they say, blameless in his behavior. This Greek word, above reproach, is used in the New Testament only in this epistle. In verse 2 of chapter 3, chapter 5, verse 7, chapter 6, verse 14. It means to have nothing. Think of this as the definition. It means to have nothing in one's conduct on which someone can ground a charge or accusation. It's not that they are not arrows shot at the elder. It's just that none of those arrows stick. Because if you become a pastor or an elder or a deacon and you put yourself out in public ministry, guess what you've put on your back? A target. Right? It's just like someone said, if you write a book, you need to prepare to defend that book because you're throwing yourself out there. Right? So above reproach, the man of God called to ministry is a man with it really could be said, a good testimony. There are no grounds for accusations that can be brought against his character. This man's character stands the test of all manner of accusations. Now, I was thinking about this above reproach idea and how to maybe marry some biblical characters with it. What are some people in the Scriptures that might come to your mind when you think about those who might be falling into this particular category? One comes to mind is in Acts chapter 11. In Acts chapter 11, if you want to turn there, you can. In verse 22, we have a leader whom the apostles put a lot of trust in, and that was Barnabas. Barnabas was a man who was above reproach. In Acts chapter 11, verse 22, it says this, now the news, this is about the church at Antioch getting started, the Spirit of God working there. It says, now the news about them reached the ears of the church at Jerusalem. So they heard about this church growing in Antioch. They were like, wow, these men are getting saved. These ladies are getting saved. These churches growing. They need spiritual leadership. They need an elder. So who do they send? Barnabas. So they sent Barnabas off to Antioch. And we're introduced to Barnabas where? Right before Ananias and Sapphira, right? Right before they were killed. You know, Barnabas had a piece of property. He sold that piece of property, and he came into the church, and there Peter, James, and John were sitting, and he says, guys, here's the money I made, this bag of money I've got, and I want to give it to the Lord. And it says he laid it at the apostles' feet, and he says, you give it and use it for the betterment of the kingdom of God. And Ananias and Sapphira were back in the background going, look, we want some notoriety like this guy. So what do? They do the same thing, but lie, and God whacks them, right? But we are introduced again to Barnabas here. Barnabas is a good man. Look at verse 23. It says, when he arrived and saw the grace of God, he rejoiced and began to encourage them all with a purposeful heart to remain true to the Lord. And look at verse 24. It says, for he was a good man and full of the Holy Spirit and of faith. and a considerable crowd was brought to the Lord. So by all accounts, we can say that our beloved Barnabas here was a man who was above reproach in every way. All right, let's keep going. The next quality trait that we find here in this list is the husband of one wife. The husband of one wife. Here is the first quality, character quality of being above reproach. So you could kind of use the above reproach term as an umbrella term, and all of these other terms fall under what it means ultimately to be above reproach. And the first one is to be the husband of one wife. So here's a couple things to understand about this. If the elder under consideration is married, he is to be a one-woman man. This quality here is not pointing out that only married men can hold the title of overseer. This is not the point. Single men can be elders, right? That's not what he's saying. This qualification then has nothing to do with his marital status. Paul is emphasizing something much greater. The aspiring elder has to be faithful, a faithful, loving husband to his wife. And Paul really in the Greek is saying he's a one-woman man. All husbands, all Christian husbands, right, ought to obey this command. All Christian husbands are to be devoted to their wives as Christ is devoted to the church. This quality is not just a requirement for the pastors, it's a requirement for every man who says he is a Christian. He must be the same kind of guy, right? There's been a little confusion for some about this particular passage. Some have held that Paul is teaching that an overseer has to be married. But this would contradict even Paul himself, right? Because in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 7 through 8, he's advocating singleness. If you've got the gift of singleness, stay single. Because if you're single, you ain't got the worries of a wife. You don't have the worries of a spouse to take care of. You can serve the Lord. So if you're here tonight and God providentially, you are single, just think how effective you could be for Christ. Because you don't have to go work and provide insurance for your wife, or you don't have to work for an extra mouth to feed. You can work and just live on what meager income you have, and you can serve the Lord. Where do you want me to go, Lord, right? So this would contradict Paul if he's saying you got to be single or you have to be married to be an elder. Others believe this passage rules out men who have been remarried. But this would contradict what Paul has written in Romans 7, verses 2 to 3, 1 Timothy 5:14, because in both of those passages, Paul does permit remarriage to occur under certain circumstances. So without belaboring that, Paul is saying that the elder, the future elder here must be a one-woman man. Next, he says temperate. Here's our next Christian character quality. What does temperate mean? We don't use that kind of language much, do we? When we think about, man, you're such a temperate person. I don't think I've ever heard anybody give that descriptor to someone. Well, here this means watchful, alert, vigilant. A leader must be one who thinks soberly about matters. To be temperate is not to be controlled. One way to look at this word is not to be controlled by others or outside sources. Being temperate is an important quality for a spiritual leader. He is to be controlled not by the wind of the congregation, right? He is not to be controlled about the next best thing coming down in church growth. He needs to be wise. He needs to be controlled by the Spirit of God. Thabiti Anwabile, in his book, Finding Faithful Elders and Deacons, states this about being temperate. The Lord calls his under-shepherds to be sober in their desires, feelings, and attitude. The temperate man places limitations on his freedoms. He may be free to do certain things, but he's wise enough to know that he can't give himself to this or to that. The importance of this is when that the temperate man can't allow his desires or others' desires to override his judgment about spiritual matters. He's able to be objective, right? I can't pick a side here. I'm not here picking sides. I'm on the Lord's side. I'm here to help you, in the sense like if you're in a counseling situation, you need to be temperate. You need to be wise in how to help people. You can't take things personally. You can't lose your cool. You have to be wise and filled with the Spirit and able to say, how can I better help people spiritually make the right decisions for the church and for the glory of God? You see, the worst decisions that we can ever make can be those motivated by our own what? Your own flesh, your own desire. And as a leader in the church, man, you got somebody at the helm who is, if you have somebody at the helm who is not temperate, he may try to make things all about himself and not looking out and say, this is what's best for the church. This is what God's word says. So the elder here, when it says he is temperate, he's a serious man. He understands his own heart, his own desires, and he's able to balance his heart with the truth. That's what it means to be temperate. And then Paul says sensible. What does it mean to be sensible? Well, the Greek word used here can be translated. Some of your texts might say prudent. Who has that? Prudent, with the same meaning. Sensible, prudent is wisdom, right? He's self-controlled. The meaning of this word is to convey oneself as self-controlled, of sound mind, someone who doesn't make insensible decisions. Maybe in our modern day vernacular, we might say that this person has good sense, good common sense. People that demonstrate prudence are those models of self-control, right? They apply good judgment to life. And they're able to lead others with an objective perspective. So sensible is an excellent character quality here. You see, the overseer, as Paul says here, must be prudent because of the nature of his work. Think about it. As an elder, you will have to help people with disagreements, conflicts, even to be a problem solver. You want someone with a track record of making matters better and not worse. That's what you're looking for. Men who can't lead in this way, listen, are not called to the office of elder because of their lack of sensibility and their inability to look at a situation from an objective standpoint and apply biblical truth to it. Being sensible brings this to bear. Alexander Strauch, in his book on eldership, says prudence is an essential quality of mind for a person who must exercise a great deal of practical discernment in handling people and their problems. So in the church, issues, listen, will arise, right? Issues are going to come up. And this is a call for wisdom and prudence in dealing with these, because what is the goal of every Christian within the church? One of the big goals is to maintain unity in the body, is it not? Every one of us here tonight have the responsibility of maintaining unity. And therefore, the pastors of the church need to be sensible in dealing with issues within the congregation, dealing with issues that will come up that maintain that unity and don't cause further division. Our next word in Paul's list of traits is one vitally, I believe, mean, all of these are important, right? There's none rises over the next. But this next one, respectable, in my mind, is a very essential to this list. So the man that God has called to lead his church are men, obviously, with certain character traits that make them, I would say, attractive to follow, right? Not attractive in appearance per se. Not all elders can be good looking, right? But right, thank you. But guess what? Their personality, their character traits, who they are. There needs to be an attractiveness, a polarizing kind of demeanor that engenders people to them because of the giftedness that God has given to them. And one of those things is seen here, and it is this idea of being respectable. So men that God has called to church leadership are men that can be followed. During Jake's ordination, I preached 1 Timothy chapter 4, and part of that is in verse 12, where he says, show yourself as an example, right, to those who believe. The church should always be looking for a few good men to set for them the right kinds of examples. And Paul here says that an aspiring leader in the church needs to be respectable. Someone others can say, I want to be like him. I want to follow him because of how he lives. That's what Paul is saying here. Listen, being respectable is essential for leadership in any organization, right? If you just think about the bosses you have or hadn't have, the ones that were good and bad. I mean, there were certain traits that you were drawn to, some you weren't drawn to. The word here for respectable comes from the Greek word meaning to have self-control or proper behavior. Another word for respectable could be someone whose life is ordered well. Paul uses this word. Look at chapter 2 for a minute, verse 9. Paul says, likewise, I want women to adorn themselves with proper clothing. Same word that's used here, respectable. Paul wants men or women to wear clothing that is respectable, that are modest, properly. And he wants men to act respectable and to be respectable. Paul's using this word here to point out a man's respectable outward behavior. Now, there are three, and this is diving a little deeper than maybe we want to go, but we're going there. There are three areas of a man's life, listen, that make him respectable. And you can take these to the bank. Number one is his speech. Number two is his beliefs. Number three is his conduct. You want to be respected by others? You want someone to follow you? Do these well. Right? First, you need to have respectable speech. I mean, the Bible clearly says what comes out of a man's mouth is bound up in his heart. And from a man's mouth always comes foolish and idle speech. Then we already know what's bound up in his heart. James chapter 3, verse 1 warns about being a teacher of the law because of the stricter judgment that he will face due to the many words he will speak. So careless speech, listen, is rarely respected, nor does it set a good example for others to follow. Another key way a man gains respect, as we see here, being respectable, is in what he believes. This is not about how much a man knows. That rarely impresses people for long, right? Because knowledge usually brings about what? Pride. But when we think about being respectable and as it relates to what a man believes, it's really about what he is willing to stand for, what he is willing to fight for, what he's willing to die for. Listen, a man that will not stand on his convictions is a man that will not be respected. Listen, Paul was a man who stood on truth and convictions. 2 Timothy 4:7, he says, I kept the faith. I didn't break. I didn't cower. I didn't fall in love with the world like others that he lists. I kept the faith. Paul was not a man pleaser. He was a man who was committed to the truth. So the leaders will be respected, not because of their head knowledge, but because of their biblical convictions. And then their conduct. And when we see a man who has godly conduct, a man who loves his family, a man who loves others, a man who sets a good example, he is able to be followed. They respect him. He's respectable. That's the point. All right, let's move on before we run out of time. Hospitable. So an overseer then, Paul says, must be above reproach. He must be the husband of one wife. He must be temperate, sensible, respectable. And I love this one. Hospitable. I like this. Listen, one of the great things about living in the South is you've experienced, who's raised in the South, born in the South? See, you're a special breed. Right? By grace, we were born in the South. The rest of you were grafted in. I mean, it's true. Amen. Exactly, right? But one of the things about being in the South is this great thing called Southern. See, you all love it. That's why you're here. Southern hospitality, though, is an expression that many in the South grew up experience every day, right? And we know how to give it, too. If you're truly from the South, you really know how to be hospitable. The hospitality here does not just pertain to the great southern states, right? But it applies to elders within the local church. They are to be characterized by being men who are hospitable. Paul's list of character traits for men who long for this work of ministry are to be marked by hospitality. Me and Robert went to Washington, D.C., to Capitol Hill Baptist Church. I think I'm saying it right. And there was a story that they told about this guy who was in their church. And he never became an elder, but he was like the model guy of hospitality. And it got known because of what this guy did. Every time he came to church, every Sunday, he saw somebody new. He was beeline straight to him, and he took these people to lunch. So every Sunday, he would go to somebody new. And it was his family, his whole family. It just wasn't him. He had like kids and everything. And over time, he did this so much that it was almost like they got to the elders like, hey, Mr. So-and-so, look at what he's been doing all these years. Just going above and beyond, being hospitable to new people and taking them to lunch. Whether they came back to the church or not, it didn't matter. And I always thought that is just like, they used that as a great picture of what hospitality, caring for others is, right? But that's the elder. He has to be that way. He has to have this character trait. The virtue is not just to show love to strangers, but that's what the New Testament means when it says hospitality, right? Love to strangers. But it gives others a way to see into our lives. That's what hospitality functions as well. When an elder is hospitable, he's basically going, come to my house. Right? And see how we live. And watch my kids, watch my wife, watch us interact, watch us have dinner together, right? We're normal, right? And hopefully, by being hospitable, other believers can see the elders and how they structure their lives and say, hey, I need to be more like this in this way or that way, right? So that's a byproduct of this hospitality. The home of the elder should be a revolving door. This home is to be a place with an open invitation for anyone in need. The elder's home is an extension of his life. When you sign up on the dotted line to be a pastor, nothing you own, nothing you possess, no longer your time or anything is yours anymore. It's really others. It's really others. The elder's home then is an extension of his life, not a place to run to and hide from the world. Now, at times that is needed, right? There's a need for that. But the elder is to characterize himself as one as hospitable. Now, the Greek word, if you're not aware, comes from this idea of love for strangers. What a great picture, right? What a great meaning. Such a vivid image of what it means to care for someone else. It's easy to love those who love us. It's easy to love those, it would be easy for me to invite you into my home and feed you some BLTs, right? But to invite a mere stranger into your house and show them the same love is what true hospitality is all about. In the broader sense, the Christian attitude that every one of us ought to have, right, is that of hospitality. Even Hebrews chapter 13, verse 2 says, do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers. So as believers, we are to be demonstrating this attitude to those we meet, everybody we meet. But as leaders in the church, Paul is saying elders set the pace for other believers to follow. Being hospitable, they mark out a clear path for others to follow. And I believe over the years, this has been one of the areas of our lives that early in ministry, we were just constantly having people in our home. And over the years, as we've gotten older, obviously, right? And more mature, you become a little more like, okay, strategic in who you invite into your home and why you're doing it. So there's seasons of life where this may be a greater opportunity. Even when you have young kids and you're inviting other young families into your home, that's a great ministry, right? And even when you get into the middle age where you have middle schoolers and homeschoolers, that's a different season of life for pastors and for you as well. And there's just always great ministry that can be done when we open our homes and invite people in and love them in that way. But the elder is to set the pace for this kind of activity. All right. Let's just put a pause right there for tonight and just open the floor up for any questions, and then we will pick up right here. I'm going to skip the able to teach for the next time and the leading his own household well, and we're going to look at those together as ability. And we will pick up the next time we're together, because I think next week we don't have equipping hour, right, Bailey? And then, so the first week of December, we will start with not addicted to wine.